not going to stick to a strict chronological approach because of course, Stuart will sort of tell us to look for the themes anyway. But we'll ask perhaps Robin to start and to talk a little bit about perhaps how you first encountered Stuart and where you first met.
Well, I first encountered Stuart as a sort of very much younger member of the London New Left Club. I mean, I would have been 18 or 19 years old, and Stuart would have been about 28. But that was a huge gulf then. It shrank, I'm glad to say, a bit later on, and I would get to know him better. But to begin with, I was part of the crowd and sitting at his feet, as one was almost literally doing, because Stuart was a wonderful speaker and would attract an audience. And the London New Left Club held its meetings not all that far from here in Oxford Street, in the basement of the Academy Cinema, as it then was, which was called the Marquee Club, and is directly related to the Marquee Club that I think still exists in Wardour Street, unless I'm out of date on that, which I may be. But it's migrated around. At that time, the Marquee Club, during most of the week, was British jazz and American blues singers and artists of one sort or another. And the New Left added on the sort of Monday night, you know, the night that wouldn't be so attractive for the more musical audience. I think members of the New Left Club were found in the Marquee on other nights, including Stuart, who had a great passion for jazz and for Miles Davis. But the topics that would be dealt with really arose out of what was happening in the universities and Left Review and the New Reasoner. The New Reasoner was mainly dominated by people who'd been dissidents inside the British Communist Party and who became oppositionists at the time of the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, and who formed a journal called first The Reasoner and then The New Reasoner, and this was Edward Thompson and John Saville and Dorothy Thompson and others. Stuart was co-editor with Charles Taylor and sundry others of the Oxford-based journal Universities and Left Review, and in a way it was responding to similar international developments, but one could mention in particular the Suez invasion and the opposition, which there was quite significant opposition, a big demonstration in Trafalgar Square to the Suez expedition, and this was around the time of the formation of the first campaign for nuclear disarmament. It's actually 1958 where you get the actual Aldermaston March, and the London New Left and the New Reasoner and ULR and Stuart were very much involved in that. So it's interesting that someone coming from Jamaica, someone who was very political and aware of the Cold War and what was going on in the world, there's a famous sort of occasion when Stuart and his friends organised a victory dinner for the National Liberation Movement in Vietnam, following Dien Bien Phu, the big defeat of the French, and leading to the eventual evacuation of the French from most of the country. And so the topics that we discuss in the New Left Club here in London would include big international events. And I remember, for example, Isaac Deutscher coming to speak to us about the Hungarian uprising and Soviet politics. And just to give you a flavour of things, I also remember Paul Johnson coming along, then editor of the New Statesman, and he gave a fiery discourse on how fascism menaced France because of the collapse of the Fourth Republic and the rise of de Gaulle. I mean, he always had a penchant for a bit of exaggeration, whether he was on the left or the right. But there was also quite a cultural content. I wouldn't say it was as strong as it subsequently became in Stuart's work, but part of the New Left at that time did include, well, there was Doris Lessing, who was a member of the editorial board. The two journals combined to form New Left Review in 1960. She was one of those founding editors. And her Golden Notebook was a book all of us were reading. And if you wanted to get a flavour of what life was like, especially for the New Reasoner crowd, then that would be it, the way she describes these communists and ex-communists having really passionate interest and knowledge, detailed knowledge about really what was going on in the entire world, you know, Africa, South America, Asia. And she found something admirable and attractive about that, especially the engagement also with the fight against white supremacy in South Africa, while she didn't like other aspects of it. So she was a sort of New Left figure. And you've got Colin McInnes, who wrote a number of novels which I think stand the test of time about the New Britain of the 1950s and immigration and other topics of that sort. Very vivid and quite successful. Dennis Potter was who I knew rather well actually at this point, because I was at Oxford and so was Potter. Dennis Potter, I mean, he only writes 1 or 2 articles for New Left Review, but it gives you an idea of the range that was going on there. And I suppose, well, what did we do apart from going on demonstrations and going to meetings at the New Left Club? Well, there was there were study groups, and I would remember the category would be like sort of contemporary capitalism. And so the idea was there was something called capitalism out there. This was something denied by Anthony Crossland, who was the theorist of the Labour Party at that point. And so we were insisting, no, there's still capitalism, generating wealth from poverty and subject to crisis. But we thought it was a new sort of capitalism, so it's contemporary capitalism. And this is Raphael, Samuel and Stuart. They're saying it's not generating in every way the same sort of society. There's quite a debate on what they called the sense of classlessness, and that was a very big topic with the early New Left. I think Raymond Williams was undoubtedly a major figure, and Richard Hoggart, who may have attended very few New Left meetings. I mean, I can't recall one myself. But he was certainly someone whose uses of literacy we were reading, and somehow he seemed to be part of the conversation from his own distinctive standpoint. There's a sort of Leavisite current was quite significant there, and D.H. Lawrence, and the great writer for Stuart was Henry James, and everybody would say Stuart's working on his thesis, which was about Henry James. And though he wrote some quite fascinating texts on topics like commitment, which was a concept he didn't, the idea of political commitment by the artist was something he didn't actually support, you know. Writing should be politically informed and engaged, but for some reason he didn't like I think it was a debate started by Jean-Paul Sartre. But Sartre, on the other hand, Simone de Beauvoir, they would be writers that we would be reading. The Second Sex came out within a year or two in an English edition, and that was important. And there was a sense that within the campaign for nuclear disarmament, that really the New Left clubs, of which there were eventually 20 or 30, that they were the sort of place where you came to discuss strategy and politics. The campaign for nuclear disarmament was a bit patriotic and moralistic. It was Britain leads the way to a more ethical this, that and the other. Whereas Stuart and co in the London New Left Club and the other New Left clubs in Yorkshire and Oxford and so forth, they were exploring positive neutralism. And so they were interested in what was happening in Ghana and India and the Bandung movement and later Cuba and so forth. So that was just a somewhat different strand. So I've probably gone on too long, but that's to give you, I'm trying to evoke some of the atmosphere at the time.
Just 2 points on that I'd like to draw out, if that's all right. There's one being, we always hear about 68 being the great generation for the New Left, but actually from what you're saying, it sounds like the sort of period of 56 to 58 could be a rival to that in importance.
I think that's a fascinating point, and you know, now you say it, I think I'm going to adopt it. Yeah, I sort of feel that it was a very English phenomenon, but especially the ingredients that I've been mentioning. But definitely one of the things that we felt is that the New Left, I mean, these New Leftists were all mainly young people, and someone like Stuart, or especially Edward Thompson, seemed quite old to us. But it was the time of mods and rockers, and BBC 4 has recently had some fantastic series on music, you know, in the 60s and so forth, and it does show that there was quite a ferment already going on in the late 50s and early 60s, and because it was premonitory, but it had a generational flavour, and the first editorial of New Left Review that Stuart must have written says we will be taking an interest in youth culture, and this is not because we want to be trendy and show that, but it's because we believe that the social revolt against capitalism, that we can see it in the emergence of this youth culture and the new types of freedom. And he publishes a most extraordinary piece about the difficulty of getting Labour Party to see the purpose of striking down homophobic laws, you know, the criminalisation of homosexuality. So in 1961, Stuart is publishing a piece on the huge difficulty there was organising this. I mean, curiously enough, the Wilson's later Home Secretary, Jenkins, did actually begin to move on this question. It wasn't because the Labour Party was a great mass of pressure from the Labour Party to do it. It was more that there was a sort of swinging 60s, this sort of new youth culture. That was a sort of type of sexual liberation idea was beginning very, I think it tips over after the later 60s. I think, however, one would have to say that from the very beginning, if there's something British about the New Left movement, almost from the beginning there's something a bit American about it too. And the first issue of the magazine had a letter to the New Left from C. Wright Mills, and Mills I actually got to know quite well. He lived over here in London for a while. He was taking part in the London New Left Club, and he wrote the letter to the New Left, which would be January 1960, was then republished and was almost a founding document as much as the Port Huron statement of the American New Left. I mean, of course, Mills himself is not just an American, but from the heart, from the Midwest, you know, not one of these sort of coastal liberals as sometimes stereotyped, but really a heartland American radical. But somehow there was a rapport. I mean, he got on tremendously well with Stuart, with Edward Thompson, Dorothy Thompson. So there was quite a kinship there.
And just a quick point relating to something you said, talking about the New Left clubs. How partisan were they? I mean, was everybody who went along to these a member of a political group, or were people finding their feet politically? Was it a very open atmosphere?
Very much finding their feet in an open atmosphere. And basically, this was sort of somehow a moment where the smaller far-left groups sort of hardly existed. There would just be a couple of dozen people. On the other hand, there's the Communist Party, but it's just been blown apart by all the divisions over Hungary and the Stalin and Khrushchev's speech, those revelations. And so lots of people are coming along who are just looking for new political directions and new political... And there is a sort of feeling that we've got to do better than the social democracy on the one hand, or Stalinism on the other. And somehow social democracy had been too much implicated. I mean, it was associated with bureaucratic reformism that was quite alienating and didn't express this youthful upsurge. I mean, curiously enough, an outfit like the Open University in the end probably came to represent a compromise, and probably one would say that the writings of Edward Thompson and Richard Hoggart, I'm sure Chris can expand on this later on, had a lot to do with, for example, later on Channel 4 being set up. I think it probably had fed in its own way into the Open University, and of course quite a number of people, including Stuart himself, went to actually teach and work there. So, so it was getting out to quite a broad audience. It wasn't and of course the CND was such a broad movement with 100,000, 200,000 on its biggest demonstrations. I'm sad to say that all this gradually wound down after about 62, 63. The New Left Club subsided, CND subsided. They still kept up the march, but it'd be 10,000 or 20,000 rather than 100,000, right up to the late 60s. Probably détente and the test ban treaty helped to deflate things a bit, and also Harold Wilson somehow put on, I mean, he demonstrated some agility and vigour as an opposition leader in the early 60s, and came up with these denunciations of decrepit old regime Britain that seemed to catch some of the mood, and he would even pick up phrases, not directly from Stuart, I don't think, but possibly from Raymond Williams, or there was a sort of modernising thrust, and there was some element of the New Left was interested in the modernising thrust. I mean, that was definitely part of it, but there was also an incipient critique of modernity associated with the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the view that not all technology is benign in its consequences, and so that was the modernising thrust was sort of somewhat qualified by this sensibility, which bits of the New Left were quite attracted to. I mean, this is the time when Rachel Carson is publishing Silent Spring and so forth, and I think by a sort of osmosis the New Left would pick up these scraps of ideas, but actually as a movement it sort of gradually disappeared, and I think probably quite a lot of people involved went back into the Labour Party or remained in the Labour Party, and there was and were part of the Labour left. I mean, the fact that some of them were, who'd been students, would also go into trade unions, and that would get them not being perhaps members of the Labour Party, but in some sort of relationship to it.
I'll just ask you, if that's all right, to perhaps give us a little bit of insight into the early years of New Left Review and the relationship between Thompson and Stuart Hall, and then that'll perhaps take us through towards the Birmingham period, and then bring Chris in on that.
Right, well, New Left Review is published in January 1960, and it was a very attractive journal, broad format, or sort of about the size of something a bit like The Economist, perhaps, or The Spectator. It was that sort of shape of magazine, or New Statesman. It was coming out every 2 months, so it wasn't quite as topical as they were, but it had quite a lot of short articles, it had illustrations, So, and the first issues were printed around nearly 10,000 copies, and I think they sold out. So the actual subscriptions were never more than about 2,000 or 3,000, but with bookshop sales, that more than accounted for the total print run. However, with C&D subsiding and the movement subsiding, so did the sales of the journal, dropping down more to, and then of course, actually getting it distributed through bookshops was not that easy. There isn't a strong magazine culture in this country, as there is in France and some others, where bookshops just habitually sell magazines. They don't do that in England, or they certainly didn't then. There were economic difficulties too. And I think there were some tensions between Edward and Stuart. Edward was probably the natural person to have become editor, but he declined it because he'd been working hard for this oppositional current in the Communist Party, really for 5 or 6 years, and it had taken a big toll on him, and he lived in Yorkshire too. He didn't particularly want to come down to London, yet London seemed the obvious place to edit the journal. So he became later on the chairman of the New Left board, and there were some tensions there because Edward would give lots of backseat advice. I mean, really, one of the things I know about this is there was a big file of letters to Stuart from Edward when the new team, of which I was a member, took over, and Stuart said, "You won't be needing these." Walked off with them. I'd be interested to know where they are, and whether they still exist somewhere. They possibly do. But basically, I mean, this didn't mean that Stuart didn't have enormous respect for Edward, which I'm sure he did. And by 1968, they collaborated in the May Day Manifesto with Raymond Williams. So they were certainly, but I think Stuart was a bit burnt by the experience of running a magazine with a 20, 30 strong editorial board and lots of disputes, not about high politics really, but about mundane issues to do with producing a magazine, which I can tell you can breed all sorts of problems and is enormously demanding on time and energy and everything. So the review, I mean, Stuart really quite perfectly voluntarily resigned, and the board, and he had encouraged Perry Anderson to come on board, and later myself, and really a group from an Oxford student magazine called New University, because I'd been involved in it, Perry had been involved in it, Mike Rustin and Alan Shuttleworth, all became editors of New Left Review. So actually, although all the standard accounts tell you it's New Reasoner and Universities and Left Review, that's absolutely correct, they were the founding journals. But funnily enough, this little student journal did provide nearly half a dozen editors to the, a much more modest journal was produced from that time, more looking like a book, and usually with about 100 pages, 120 pages. So more like the New Left Review that you might be knowledgeable of or know about today. And but slowly the circulation over a period of, 4 decades or 5 decades, gradually worked steadily up from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5,000, until today it's just short of the 10,000 that it started off with in 1960. Of course, it's a different type of journal. Stuart occasionally wrote for it, I mean, not as often as we would have liked, but he did publish some important articles on the authoritarian, defending his account of Thatcherism and the rubric of authoritarian populism, and writing about Nikos Boulantsis and the necessary revisions to the socialist project in light of developments in the communist world. He also let us publish the most wonderful text on Caribbean identities that was the Walter Rodney Memorial Lecture. Actually, if you want a flavour of the early New Left, Stuart wrote for NLR 2 wonderful essays. One is The Life and Times of the New Left, which was published eventually in the journal just 2 years ago. He actually wrote it in 1990, and it was in a Verso collection, but it's probably more accessible in the New Left Review from its website. And he also published a memoir at the time of the death of Raphael Samuel, his co-founder of New Left Review, in the mid-90s. And it gives an account of the atmosphere of the early New Left and of things like, I mean, Raphael Samuel was, as Stuart said, very much, I mean, he was capable of founding several and being the animating force between a number of vital institutions. And that included later the History Workshop Journal and Movement. But he was also the London New Left Club. He was really the impresario, usually there. And then there was the Partisan Coffee House, which was in Carlisle Street. Stuart actually gives a riveting account of the slightly phantasmagoric menu, which sort of seemed to combine the sort of food that Charles Dickens' character might have eaten, you know, Surrey fowl with caper sauce, or borscht or stroganoff. You know, it would have a definitely Middle European flavour, and with a bit of Jewish cooking in there too. And so Stuart provides a marvellous account there of the early New Left. I would say that, because we should certainly go on to other matters now, but I think there was enough important in that whole New Left experience to keep those involved, who included Raphael Samuel, who included, of course, Stuart himself, to keep them attached to the name and the goal of the New Left. They never disavowed it, and I think in some ways they were always trying to retain its spirit and find new forms of expression of that early New Left movement. And I think you can find that in the fact that he writes texts like The Life and Times of the New Left, you know, about 40 years later. He's still writing very positively about it. And that's above all the particular disagreements over what articles should go where in the issue and all that.
Well, we want to, Chris, now perhaps move geographically on to Birmingham as well.
Well, I can't come to Birmingham, but I approached Hall from a different juncture, to use one of Hall's common terms. Hall to me means a representation rather than a person. I knew him as a representation more than a person, perhaps appropriately for his interest in cultural studies. But listening to Robin there, it strikes me that that historically specific period when the New Left Review really was active and changing things, and had a strong sense of comradeship despite the ripples of discontent within the group, sort of lasted from roughly about 1956 with the Hungarian discontent to 68 when the revolution in France didn't happen. And then it began to be more fragmented as I see it. You might want to comment later on, but that's how I see it. And in a sense, you can see people like Hall casting an eye back to that period, not nostalgically, but wondering why we couldn't reconstitute something in that vein in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Certainly that comradeship that I feel resonated from what Robin was talking about, that high seriousness. They really believe they're doing something serious. They had clear targets. That has never been evident in my academic life. In the departments I've been in, there's been nothing like that. It's been much more fragmentary, it's been much more broken up. And in a kind of wishy-washy way, it's been more global in my life. I think the New Left Review was interested in America and was interested in the Soviet bloc, but it was also a very British outfit, really. And towering intellectuals. When you compare Robin, Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, Edward Thompson, sort of in one room together, it's uncommon. It was an historically specific and unique period. So that's my little preamble about that very interesting thing that Robin was talking about then. I came to Hall as a representation rather than a person, and I came to him because throughout my academic career I've also been a publisher. I worked for Routledge for 8 years publishing sociology books, and I still work, have since 1994, worked with Sage Publications publishing books and journals. And the defining moment, really, or the defining theme from my publishing career in the social sciences has been what's known as the cultural turn. And the cultural turn is very much associated not with Raymond Williams so much, but with Stuart Hall. I think very unfairly. I think Raymond Williams deserves reassessment, a major reassessment. It'd be interesting to see what thoughts you have about the influence that Williams had on Hall, because Williams, as soon as he died, seems to have been taken off the curriculum, as far as I can see. People don't teach Williams. There are no courses on Williams. So Hall, and certainly in America, Hall became the absolute apostle of cultural studies. And why was that interesting? Well, he was saying, let's take culture seriously. To a certain extent, Hoggart had said that. But Hall was really weaving it in with popular music, magazines, television, and so on and so forth. A much more multimedia approach was, I think, truly evident in Hoggart's work. Hoggart brought Hall to the Birmingham Institute, and that's really where I began to get interested. I wasn't really conscious of it at that time. I did a social science degree at Leicester University, where the view was that the greatest sociologist of the world was somebody that nobody had heard of, called Norbert Elias, who was in Leicester. He got his first job at 57 and wrote a book, some of you may know, called The Civilizing Process, which came out in the late 70s, 80s. And we were aware in the 70s of Birmingham, and without researching it, we thought they were subversive. We thought they were doing something to bring down the country, the government. We associated them with no good, or very good if we were of the opinion that what they were up to was something congenial to us. But we never, it was only 40 miles away, there was no contact whatsoever between us and them. They never came to visit us. I think someone called Chas Critcher did come once to Leicester, and someone called Eric Dunning from Leicester went to Birmingham, but there was no traffic between those two areas. It's interesting that, you know, this comradeship and this excitement that Robin conveys, we mustn't ignore the fact that it was a very almost provincial approach in Britain. There were different pockets doing different things in the country rather than a whole movement in the country, despite the New Left Review being perhaps the most foremost rallying point for a particular kind of political standpoint. Hoggart left to go to UNESCO, I think it was, in about 1970, I think it was 70, and Hall took over as the director of the Institute, the Contemporary Institute of Contemporary Cultural Studies. And that's really where I got interested in Hall in the late 80s, because I began to publish the people he taught. People like Angela McRobbie, Paul Willis, David Morley, Paul Gilroy. They were all Hall's students. And one of the things that immediately struck me, being sort of anything between 15 to 5 years younger than them, they all had a bit of a chip on their shoulder. They all saw themselves as kind of harassed, marginal figures. By the time I knew them, nearly every one of them was a professor, so this puzzled me. What was that all about, I thought. And from what I can piece together, the people in Birmingham when they were students felt very beleaguered. They felt that they were under attack from the university authorities, who were suspicious of them. I think that the English faculty did see them as subversive and resented the fact that rather than talking about the turn of the screw and so on and so forth, they were actually analysing television programmes. They saw that as bad and worrying and troubling and trivial. Saw it as trivial. Paul Willis won't mind me saying that in order to convey to you the kind of moral fervour of what they were up to, Paul Willis told me that it was regular in the Monday morning seminars for people in the Birmingham School who were going to give their paper to be sick before they gave the paper. Such was their intense concern to actually say something of relevance. Stuart Hall was a kind and gentle man. In my 2 meetings of him, and all that I know about him suggests he was kind and gentle. but he was also very serious. And I think that seriousness is something that people tried to live up to and emulate, and it was a tasking thing for them to live up to that. So Hall writes, well, the other thing about Hall which is interesting for academics, particularly the younger ones who are asked to publish a book every 3 weeks, Hall never wrote a book. He co-wrote a book with Paddy Scannell on the arts in '65, and I think his best book is called Policing the Crisis, but that was a collective enterprise with people in the centre. What we know of his books, as his books, are in fact collections of articles. And when you listen to Robin and he tells us that 10,000 copies of the New Left Review are still being sold, it's good work in publishing if you sell 700 copies of a book these days worldwide. The publishing trade has experienced an incredible decline in book sales. It doesn't mean that they're all going out of business, because the material, the intellectual content is being sold digitally in other ways. But the actual sale of books is not what it used to be. And I think that's relevant because the way in which Hall and the New Left Review grew communicated was through articles rather than books. And then when a particular period had been reached with a particular set of themes, they would publish a book, or some of them would publish books. So I don't know if you know Policing the Crisis, but it begins with a report in the Birmingham Evening Press of an old age pensioner being mugged in the centre of Birmingham by 3 Asian boys. And there are very strong calls for hanging, flogging, all the rest of it, you know, not hanging, but putting them into prison for a very long time. I think from memory, I didn't prepare for this speech as well as I should have, I think the press was calling for a 20-year sentence for these boys. And this is what interested Hall. He thought, why is this going on? There was the ethnic, racial aspect, which maybe Robin can talk about. Was Hall the, I'll come back to it, was Hall the only non-white person in the New Left Review, or were there others?
At that point,
he was.
I think so, yeah. Of the founding editors.
Yeah. Well, if you haven't read Policing the Crisis, it is a wonderful book, because from that one episode of an event in Birmingham, Hall and his associates trace the unravelling of the British state, going back to about 1880 and right up to the early 1970s. He predicts in that book what he later called authoritarian populism. He sees the Callaghan, Wilson years as years where Britain could not be changed, where the hope that many working people and many intellectuals had for a transformation of Britain had not been achieved. And there was a turn towards market solutions. Hall then leaves in was it 19? I'm getting the dates slightly wrong, but in the 80s, I think, he leaves to go to the Open University, where he is called Professor of Sociology, which as a trained sociologist, I always sort of feel uncomfortable about, because he's not really a sociologist. He's an intellectual, primarily, Stuart Hall. He isn't really, I think, somebody who would be seen as a sociological figure as such. He's an intellectual figure who's more in the area of culture, I think. And then what happens in the 90s, of course, in the 80s, of course, is Mrs. Thatcher. And that really is the dominant mark of Hall's work in the 80s, authoritarian populism, talking about the rise of the new right. What Hall's problem is why are the people who are going to be worst affected by these policies voting for them? What is going on? And Hall, who, when he was director of the Birmingham Institute, was very keen to read continental philosophy, continental sociology, continental sources, American sources of all sorts. Hall was, I think, a fantastic reader at this time. Of the figures he was reading then, the two most important were Gramsci and Althusser, which is quite surprising. Hall's interest in ideology comes from Althusser, and Hall's interest in hegemony and many other things. In fact, Hall's interest in how societies hang together, decompose, change, really comes from Gramsci, I think. Hall wrote a wonderful piece about Gramsci before he died. It came about 10, 15 years before he died, where if you want to get a sense of why you should read Gramsci, you should read Hall's 30-page article. So Hall goes through all of that, and then begins, I think, we were talking earlier before the group of the audience came in, that I think Hall, who was always essentially a utopian, began to get quite melancholic, although kept cheerful right up to the end of his life, despite having physical problems. I think he got melancholic primarily because of Tony Blair. That was really the end of the story, I think, for him in terms of meaningful transformation. More conservative than the Conservatives, I think, Paul would think. And Hall becomes, towards the end of his life, not so much interested in academic matters, it seems to me, but in aesthetic ones. He becomes interested in photography, particularly, art in particular. Very, very critical of cultural studies. He wanders around cultural studies conferences in the 90s and just can't understand what people are doing, because from his point of view, it's lost its political strand. What cultural studies is doing in the 90s, right up to now, is people writing about their own enthusiasms. So they're writing articles, books about things, but there's no politics in the way that there was in the New Left high watermark moment, when it was clear that what was on the agenda was transformational politics. Again, I think the younger people in the audience may find it difficult to think in terms of the ordinary vernacular in which politics was discussed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s among academics of the left. They were talking about changing things. Whereas as a result of Foucault and postmodernism, we have much more of a micro response, a more discursive response to the question of change. That wasn't really so evident, I think, in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. It was really about getting rid of a particular power block, to use Gramsci's Hall's terms, and replacing it with another one. Anthony Giddens is very, very critical of Hall because he criticizes the late Hall, work of the late Hall, as essentially protectionist. From Giddens' point of view, what Hall is arguing for is a protectionist state, high taxation, trade controls, return to trade unionism. All of these things, which for the author of The Third Way, Giddens wrote The Third Way, all of these things are non-starters in the modern world as far as Giddens is concerned. And so Giddens and many people around him see Hall as a period piece by that time. His time has gone. Hall is somebody whose era has passed. It's ironical that he died a year after Mrs. Thatcher, and she was the bête noire, and in a way, somebody who brought together 20 to 30 years of thinking. For some people in the audience too, it may come as a surprise to know that Hall's father was the chief accountant of the United Fruit Company, and Hall himself went to Jamaica College, which I believe is the leading public school in Jamaica. And Hall's old house was lived in by Eartha Kitt, so that was a very famous Caribbean singer. Hall never really felt at home in Britain. If you look at any interview with him, if you look on YouTube, you see he often returns to the experience that he had with Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor was a Canadian white guy in Oxford in the 50s. Hall felt trivialized. Hall felt that by reason of colour he wasn't really taken seriously, which was a major problem for him psychologically, because his mother, who he had a troubled relationship with, was very, very keen on him doing well in Oxford, and very, very proud of his achievement in Oxford and so on. Hall in one place describes Jamaican class society as the most complex in the world, because of skin colour gradations. There are many, many different gradients of class formations in Jamaican society. And Hall's interest in class, I think, could be said to sort of wane as he grew older. I think he retained optimism, but he ceased to think that working class transformation was a real possibility, and became much more interested in aesthetics, as I said, and ethnicities of various kinds. His work on hybridity suggested hybridity was a key issue in terms of understanding how the modern world works. Hyphenated identities. Afro-British, Caribbean-British, Pakistan-British, etc., etc. Again, reflecting very much the kind of move that we associate with Foucault and the postmodernists in terms of discourse, in terms of fragmentation, in terms of not exactly an incoherent period in terms of cultural and social matters, but one where things don't add up as they were adding up in the 60s and 50s, where it was clear that there was a group with similar interests that were pursuing them in a particular way and could identify with a wider constituency. By the 80s, that seems to be, among intellectuals on the left in the UK, something that waxes and wanes. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I don't know, sort of what we're scribbling on with whether you wanted to come back on it.
Just very briefly on a couple of the points. You know, in a way, this theme of classlessness is constant throughout Stuart's development. I mean, it's actually the title of an essay in the Universities and Left Review. It's then a debate with Raphael Samuel. And one of the curious things is that he founds the Birmingham School, which you know much more about than I do, but somehow I see a lot of the work of Hoggart and Williams as being about a form of cultural class awareness. There's a sort of saturation of the aesthetic with class questions. And that's characteristic of British novels and films of the 50s and 60s. And it's almost as if there's a whole generation, not to speak of two, who are upwardly mobile through the universities and are leaving behind working class childhoods, which they still feel very attached to and nostalgic about. But none of all this applies to Stuart. So why did he become the director and the inspirer of this whole movement that seemed to be about class, when actually Stuart, he doesn't come from a working class background. He comes, as you rightly say, from a sort of, I mean, you know, he's a Jamaican, but he's come from a very well-off or sort of elite background in Jamaican terms. And I do think that Stuart did retain, on the other hand, his political engagement, because you see this through the journal soundings. I mean, journals were always very important to Stuart. We've mentioned New Left Review. We haven't mentioned, and we should mention, Marxism Today, which published some of his best texts of the 1980s, and well, it wound itself up in about 1991, I think. So, although it did publish a critique, a special issue attacking Blair, which you rightly say was a sort of bête noire, and Stuart contributes to that. And in Soundings, which is the journal he joins and edits from, and it only has 3 editors, Mike Rustin, Doreen Massey and Stuart, so I don't think this is just a nominal, I think his contribution was quite an active one there, and it takes the form of an extended critique of neoliberalism and the workings of the market, which is something that is quite strongly linked to his critique of Margaret Thatcher, and his account of Gramsci and hegemony is partly about hegemony develops from below and through competition and consumption as much as through struggles at the point of production. There's a curious way that Stuart is a deep down cultural theorist, and I think Chris is right about that. But at another level, there's suddenly a strand of, a very strong defining strand of political economy which kicks in. I think it's obvious in the long essay on Gramsci, where I think probably the one you're talking about is Gramsci and Race, which was published, interestingly enough, by UNESCO, because Richard Hoggart was there, in about 1982. But he's saying the great error of the traditional Marxist left is to think that the political economy is actually constructing for us, the law of value is constructing a homogeneous working class, and gradually everybody's being compressed into this homogeneous working class, the ruined middle class, the poverty, the extreme poverty, everything is getting homogenized. And therefore there's a basis for a sort of fraternal alliance against capital.
That was his objection to
and he said that is simply not the case, that if you look at it closely you'll see that the market divides as much as it unifies, and that it's quite capable of exploiting divisions between male workers and women workers, between black workers and white workers. And that's the key argument of that text, that really, a really powerful argument. And I think it's there, as I was saying, in the Gramsci, the sort of hegemony type argument, that there's an element of political economy that can be seen there.
I think that was his primary objection to the direction that cultural studies has taken, which is that the political economy aspect of culture is not prominent in terms of contemporary cultural studies writings. It's kind of always in the background in some texts, but it's not at the forefront. And Robin's absolutely right. I mean, it was at the forefront for Hall. So, although he's seen in some ways as the father of a particular kind of cultural studies, political economy is equivalently important.
is that a trend in cultural studies that would fit with a more general trend in education, higher education, with a kind of fear of critical thinking, or rejection of critical thinking in perhaps a slightly subconscious way, but one in which cultural studies becomes assimilated by being depoliticised?
Thomas Doherty in the University of Warwick is in deep trouble at the moment. He's in the Department of English, but he's criticised the neoliberal move at Warwick University. Interestingly, Thomson, was it Warwick Inc. that he wrote? It was a criticism of, in the 1970s, a criticism of Warwick University going down a corporate route. But this guy, Thomas Doherty, who's a professor of English, is apparently being threatened with a sack at the moment because he's been critical. I know from meetings in my university and others that I've been associated with, that criticism is often gestural, it seems to me, rather than real. And people don't really believe in fundamental change, I think. Certainly in my circle in terms of sociology. There's a kind of, there is no alternative, Mrs. Thatcher was horribly famous for saying, and I think people of your age, having gone through Blair, having gone through Major, and so on, maybe that is the ethos in which you've grown up, and that's perhaps, I won't speak for you, but that's maybe something that's very strong in your perspective about the world.
Certainly something that's seemed really...
yeah, I mean, Clinton didn't really deliver. Barack Obama, in many ways, is not delivering. So how can a young person believe in politics in the way that in Robin's day, in the 50s and 60s, when all of these matters were being discussed?
I do think that there's a sort of interest in Stuart in, for example, nationalism. And he works using the work of Benedict Anderson and Imagine Communities. That's a text, and it's an interesting thing because Stuart is par excellence, you know, the key figure of the first New Left, and then the second New Left that emerges, Perry Anderson and his brother Benedict. I mean, actually produce work that it's different from Stuart. It's quite interesting that you get some Althusser, who we haven't mentioned so far, as well as Gramsci, are quite significant figures, and there's an element of a sort of cultural turn going on there. And I would say that Stuart did retain, you know, I was in the happy position of being a very near neighbour of his for the last, well, not of his main London house, but of a cottage in Essex near the university there. And so I would see Stuart quite a bit. Well, he lived 2 doors down. And certainly his interest in global politics, what was happening in Latin America or in the Middle East, was just as active. And you'll find in Soundings, that magazine, you know, articles about developments in Latin America or in the Middle East. So that remained a source of intellectual stimulation and concern to Stuart. So I do think that cultural studies has sometimes had a somewhat depoliticising effect, but I certainly don't think that applies to, and I don't think you're suggesting it does. I don't think it applied to Stuart. No. Although, obviously, I mean, he did have a very serious health problem. I mean, he had to do kidney dialysis 3 times a week for 3 or 4 hours. A very, very wearing process to undergo. Actually, he remained extremely lucid and active and involved and engaged, and managed to do things like help to found this Rivington Art Gallery, and continued to write essays and to edit a journal and to be involved in the making of this film, the Stuart Hall project that I imagine a number of you have seen. So he fought back against that, but I do think it stopped him. I mean, you wouldn't expect to see Stuart campaigning in public or going to political meetings and speaking from the platform. I mean, he did occasionally do that. There was the Edward Said lecture, and he did chair that a couple of years ago. But physically, there's no doubt, really goes back about 18 years, I think, to the mid-1990s, that his health was a serious constraint.
That's a great loss to us, because for those of you that never saw him in action, he was a wonderful, brilliant lecturer, really riveting, really fantastic. But again, sort of hovering over this whole discussion, is the question of the prospects of transformation in this society and wider societies. I remember looking at an interesting thing on BBC 4, you mentioned BBC 4 just now. There's an interview with Shirley Williams, Bernard Donahue, was he the press officer of Wilson?
I think so.
And those of you who don't know, Harold Wilson resigned in 1975 after being famous for phrases like the White Heat Technological Revolution and trying to change the face of British society. And in 75 there was a lot of confusion and suspicion about why he resigned. Bernard Donahue was the press officer, and he said in this interview, Wilson had decided in 1975, after 10 years of trying, that Britain could fundamentally not be changed. That the vested interests in the country could be knocked back for 5, 7, 8 years, but they would come back in another form. They would find another person, another front to reassert themselves. And so Wilson just thought, it can't be done. The kind of hopes that were around in 61, 62, 63, by 75, Wilson had felt they're gone, really. Yeah.
I do feel that there was, I mean, the great rallying cry at that point. I mean, first there was Margaret Thatcher and her re-importation of market politics into the mainstream. In the 80s, this was pretty swiftly put to the test. And really, as early as 81, it was pretty clear that it was going to wipe out large sections of economic life in this country. Whole regions were going to be devastated by it. And so you did get this idea of an alternative economic strategy. And weirdly enough, if you look back at some of that material in the late 70s, early 80s, I mean, would we have been better off trying to develop, as Taiwan did or as China has done, you know, manufacturing and or what was banking and finance the you know, the answer? So I mean, things look very different, and of course we're meant to be in a recovery now. I don't know how deep-seated or long-lasting that will be. There is just one other thing that I want to mention and sort of bounce off Chris's remark again, that we probably left it rather a long time before mentioning this, but I don't think there's any doubt that the rise of feminism was had a huge impact on Stuart, on the Birmingham Centre. I mean, of course, his own relationship with Catherine, his wife, was one source of that in his life, but also the work of the Centre, I think, was explicitly bringing up gender stereotypes. And if you talk about whether the world can be transformed, I mean, there's 2 points. I mean, first, feminism obviously has transformed lives in very big ways, and the position of women has changed in very tangible ways. There are undercurrents or significant currents within feminism that chime in with neoliberalism. Nancy Fraser has recently been arguing that, and the argument is set out in her recent book, Fortunes of Feminism.